Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my presentation. My name is David Halushka. The topic of my presentation today is the modern American literary period. The reason that this topic is useful for you is because in learning about the hero in the novel of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, we are given a glimpse into that time period in American history and can see the tenets of this literary period come alive. We are going to talk about three things. These are: firstly, we will examine the literary period, the tenets of it, and the main authors and works of that time. Secondly, we will look at the historical period and the significant events that occurred during this literary period and influenced its authors. Finally, we are going to look at a hero of that literary period in the novel of Mice and Men, authored by John Steinbeck in the year 1937. Due to the limited time, I have 3 to 5 minutes. I request that you ask your questions at the end of my presentation. Firstly, I will summarize the literary period. The modern literary period occurred roughly between 1901 and 1950. In contrast to the realism period that preceded it, which focused on the portrayal of the world in a realistic and accurate way, modernism does not look to just capture a realistic picture of the world, but more so look to question and say something about the world. Its works often centered on a loss of faith and mistrust in social institutions and traditional beliefs, including the American dream. The writers of this period look introspectively for answers to questions about modern problems. Instead of recording the world they lived in, authors began to question and critique the world and what was happening and make statements about it. Furthermore, the modern era changed the conception of what a hero could be and introduced the flawed hero, honorable characters that were both tragic and flawed. Major authors and literary works of this time include F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway, who wrote A Farewell to Arms, and John Steinbeck, who wrote Of Mice and Men. That's the end of the first point. Now we will move on to the second point, which is about the historical period. The historical period in which the modern literary period took place was from 1900 to 1950. During that time, the world saw 2 world wars and an economic depression. The Great Depression was a time in American history when the stock market plunged, causing banks to close and severe economic inactivity across the country. Many lost their jobs as a result of this. This happened around the same time that the Dust Bowl occurred, where a severe drought devastated farming crops in the Great Plains of Oklahoma. The Dust Bowl created a population of displaced farmers who migrated from the Oklahoma Dust Bowl to California in the hopes of finding work, only to find that the effects of the Great Depression had affected the economy in California just as adversely. These events proved to be a harsh awakening for many Americans. Prior to this, the idea of the American dream, a land of prosperity and progress, and the ability of the individual to triumph was believed by many in the growing middle class. However, the stock market crash, the Depression, and the Dust Bowl caused many Americans to lose faith in this ideal and the social institutions of the country. Lastly, I will move on to the third point, which is about a literary hero of that time. The character George Milton from the novel of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck is a great example of a literary hero from the modern period. George represents a modern literary hero because he has heroic characteristics but is also tragic and flawed. He is a hero because he accepts a challenge in taking care of his mentally disabled friend in the midst of a Great Depression and unemployment. In accepting this challenge, he shows greater strength and courage than most ordinary men, and this makes him a hero. However, he is flawed because, as shown in the dialogue, even though he takes care of his friend, George often gets frustrated with Lenny and yells at him, calling him on one occasion a son of a bitch, and is often seen to be angry towards Lenny. His story is tragic because he is burdened with having to kill Lenny in order to save Lenny from a more harmful death. Killing Lenny was the best thing he could do for him, and though tragic, is an act of strength, love, and compassion. This act also shows Steinbeck presenting a modernist type of perspective, and that is the theory that one's own reason, untouched by society's influence, was the only reliable authority on any question of importance. And here, George had to rely on his own reason and how to best deal with Lenny. George had to look introspectively to find his answer. George also represents the plight experienced by many displaced farmers in California during the economic depression, and through his experiences, Steinbeck comments on the social and economic institutions in America. For these reasons, George exemplifies the tragic, flawed hero of the modern American literature period. That's all for this point. In conclusion, in this presentation, my objectives were to cover the modern literary time period and the historical events that took place during that time, and discuss George Milton as a modern, tragic, flawed hero. I have covered three main points. Firstly, we discussed the modern literary period. Secondly, we talked about the historical context surrounding the modern literary period. Finally, we discussed the modern tragic hero George Milton from the novel of Mice and Men, written during the modern literature period. I hope you have found this presentation useful. Thank you. Questions? If there are no more questions, that is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.